So, man, yeah, like I was saying, I was thinking that we could talk a little bit about secessionism. In a lot of people's minds now, with the rise of these kinds of movements in the Southwest, the various groups that purport to be pushing for um, a Yoruba nationalist agenda, and then with the rise of the indigenous peoples of Biafra movement in the east, southeastern states led by Nnamdi Kanu, and in having a conversation about the Nigerian scam or Nigeria being a scam, we thought it would be worth reflecting on these movements because that's how a lot of people think about, or what a lot of people think about when you offer like a critique of Nigeria as a concept or entity. Um, so yeah, I thought to ask you guys about like what you make of these movements so far. I mean, OAG, you're here. I think Emeka is trying to join, but he might not be. Yeah, I mean, what do you make of the rise of these movements and what they represent?
We have to be very conscious of you know the class character of this movement.
Mm,
Like okay, the thing that we have to understand now is that this ethnic chauvinism or ethnic flames, ethnicism and tribalism, the flames are burning very high now.
mm,
As he said, Falana said that if you go to some places and you criticize Igboho or Nambika, you will be risking your life.
definitely.
So like it's a fact that okay, there's Fulani or Hausa dominance in power, like they control the state and all that. But the flip side of this is that look at their own people too. The
Yeah,
Fulani proletariat or Hausa proletariat or Northern, they suffer the worst form of, oppression, human development indices. They are very
yeah,
low or at level. So we must understand the class character of things and not just say point blank or use a same singular brush to paint everything and say, oh, there's Fulani hegemony and all that.
oh
We have to
man.
look at the
I
class
mean,
character of things.
yeah, there's so many things you've said that make a lot of sense to me. I mean, but the aspect where you're talking about, the question of northern hegemony, I think is like I often find that very weird, having like grown up in the north, right? Where I'm like, what north specifically? I mean, if you say Fulani hegemony, well, Fulani people are quite different from Hausa people. I mean, like Usman Danfodio's jihad conquered seven Hausa states, and those people have been resisting for a long time. Not to mention Kanuri people, like Boko Haram is majority Kanuri, right? Those people had an empire for like, they were the longest running empire, I think, in West African history, if I'm not mistaken. They don't really submit very easily to Hausa people or Fulani people. That's the North that people like to paint as homogeneous. And by the way, we've not even talked about all the minority groups in the North. So when people say even okay, when people say the federal government is like Northern dominated, I really want them to get more specific. Not saying that there's not like some empirical reality to that. Like if you look at probably if you looked at like how the federal bureaucracy is staffed on an ethnic basis, you would probably get like like depending on what office, some that are like yeah definitely lean heavily in terms of northern representation. People are north of the Niger and Benue in general, but like to kind of pin that to one ethnic group per se, I mean I just I'm not as convinced that those people know what the hell they're talking about when they're talking about the north. And then
The
yeah.
okay, the issue there is that this harmonization of the North serves a
Mm,
purpose for the ruling class, such
definitely.
that they use it to just cohere that part of the country for their own agenda. It's essentially as if they've dominated
Yeah.
the ruling class now, has dominated the north, try to make it one in one unison, and then keep on
Mm.
advancing regardless of the internal strife going on between the minority groups or
Or
that
even the
having that
larger
having that
group.
singular northern band makes it seem as if they're in control of everything. So it's a tool essentially to
Yeah.
foster their domination and also make the minority groups feel as if they are part of the bigger picture.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
yeah, so it serves that purpose too. Serves that purpose.
Totally. No, I agree that there are, I mean, I think it's true that there are northern elite who call themselves northern elite, or who call themselves Northern, try to create this notion that the North is something meaningful that like serves the interest of quote Northern people. But I think that is as ridiculous as like, yeah, the secessionist notions that are arising in the Southeast or in the Southwest that, if we succeed on an ethnic basis or on a regional basis, then that's going to somehow provide a much more developmental or much more accountable elite than if we exist in kind of um, state form where there's a multiplicity of like ethnic groups. Yeah, I mean, I just whoever is making that argument, whether they're northern supposedly or eastern or western or whatever, I find it to be very unconvincing because why would like why would what in our history or even in our present situation where we have states, like what experience of ours suggests that ethnic elite is much more preferable to like a pan-ethnic or a pluralist elite?
I think in our own context, for the people pushing for the Yoruba nation or IPOB nation or Biafra thing, their problem usually is the lack of a deep understanding of how these
Mm,
things work. Because we can, if we look back to Ojuku's ambitions and what he wanted to do, he was still trying to like play a major role in determining the fate of the people in the eastern region, of course, in partnership with imperialists. And then we've taken that to the modern or contemporary Nigeria now, where everyone feels as if once we break it up back to the feudal times, that okay, yeah, there might still be exploitation, but it will be my own kinsman
right.
that's exploiting me, and then I might be able to live more with that, other than this more complex analysis that I have to do. That even within my own kinsmen, we have traitors, we have people that have played a crucial role in facilitating my exploitation now, my kinsmen now. Look at the
Yeah.
NDDC, for example. Now we have people that
Yeah.
are from the Niger Delta that are active participants and collaborators in the destruction and the exploitation of the people in that region. What have they
Yeah.
done to their own people? And now it is
Yeah.
people like that that band together and say they want their own Niger Delta region.
So that's the thing. It's
Don't
like that's why that idea strikes me as so odd. Is like if we give the people who are exploiting us at the closest level more power, then somehow that'll make us less exploited. I'm like, yeah, I don't really see how that logic works.
So that's the lack of analysis that's going on. That
Yeah,
people see the immediate suffering and
yeah,
quickly try to point to, okay, this is the problem, but they won't sit down to analyze it further. That look, you have people in the southwest that are now overseeing what I'll call an agberoization agenda of making everybody thugs, touts, political thugs, beggars. This is a feud.
totally.
When we talk about feudalism, this is the
Mm,
feudal manifestation in the southwest, especially in Lagos, where
yeah,
everyone is now a boss like thug, or
yeah,
that's it. And if you go to the southeast, it is cultism, political thuggery,
yeah,
so it manifests itself in different ways. The level of exploitation or how the exploitation is being done manifests itself in various ways in different parts of the country. And when we want to recede back into the enclaves of the feudalists now, that
yeah,
are active perpetrators of this thing, then it shows a flaw in the logic and thinking
yeah,
of these people that want to relieve that feudal times under the modern state or under a new kind of tribal states, I'd say.
yeah.
Yeah, so
I heard someone say the other day that like Boko Haram is in a sense the most successful successionist movement in like recent Nigerian history. Like leaving aside Biafra, Boko Haram is the group that wanted to break away and succeeded in breaking away at least some local governments and held them for like, a couple of years. Now a lot of them are surrendering or whatever. And of course, their approach was to try to inspire people on the basis of like extremist interpretations of Islam rather than ethnicity. But it has the same kind of thing where it's like Nigeria is too corrupt, the elite are not serving our interest, so we need to create a pure version of this. Either, in their case, it was like a pure religious version, but, the folks who are calling for, in effect, ethno states want a ethnically pure state to constrain the boundaries of who can rule within those states and also probably who can be a citizen on the basis of tribe. And it's like, yeah, I mean, when these groups emerge, like the way in which they're, I mean, using Boko Haram again as an example, like how they actually organize themselves is often like much more hierarchical and even brutal in itself than what we have currently, if you can imagine that. Like Boko Haram as a governing entity has been very bad at governing. Do you know what I mean? Like it governs with extreme brutality. Like even not to go very far into this question, but even like Islamic State was like, you guys are too brutal. So, I mean, of course, that's like a very, very specific example, and not to saying that Igboho and IPOB are exactly like this because they have their own peculiarities. But I'm just suggesting that, like, just because people are like the same ethnic group and even the same branch of the same religion doesn't really mean that they'll be more accountable. And I guess we've kind of beat around that point a bit in various ways, but it just seems to me like ultimately the versions of the critique of the Nigerian scam that rely on succeeding on an ethnic or religious basis only perpetuate the scam. They don't exhaust it. They don't like transcend it.
I think what should be asked is that, okay, let's imagine that we now get these ethno states now. Okay, there's Yoruba
Mm.
nation now, there's Biafra and all that. What
There's the
next?
caliphate.
Yes,
Yeah.
what next now? The people, because it might be like, okay, we have this nation now. What of the people inside of that nation? Are you
Mm.
going to ensure that they have jobs, proper decent living standards, eradication of poverty, ignorance, all these kind of
Mm.
things? Are you going to do that, or once you have your state and then you just continue the exploitation again?
Right. Exactly.
Especially looking at those at the forefront of this agitation,
Mm.
seeing that they are not talking about these core issues. Because if they are cognizant of these core issues, then it will quickly make them see that they have an alliance with suffering people in other ethnic enclaves,
Totally.
and it won't be so much about splitting it on an ethnic basis, but now creating a fair and just society, which will now lead them directly to see that the guys at the top of the Yoruba nation that they want, or the people that are currently at the helms of affairs in the Yoruba land or Igbo land, are also major exploiters. And then it knocks
Totally.
off that ethnic argument quickly. But they are not doing that. They just want
Mm.
to, and again, because I was speaking with someone, last week on this ethnic issue. Fine, people should have a say as to how they are coalesced together. Because
For sure.
okay, imperialism lodged all of us together in this Nigerian entity and all that. We do have the
Hmm.
right to say how we want to exist.
For sure.
We have the right to say. So this should be balanced, but then there's no room for ethnic chauvinism. There's no room for saying that okay, one ethnic group is better than the other and all that. But
Yeah.
on the flip side of that, people have the right to say how they want to exist. But under which conditions do you want to exist, and
And
which
then
kind of
who are the people in
yeah,
that
so
country?
who are the people that are speaking for this ethnic group? So these are the questions that
Right.
need to be asked if we want to
Yeah.
just, make sure that what we are doing is all right. Because if we say, okay, yeah, there's this apparent or clear exploitation that's going on, blah, 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 and the whole people in the Yoruba kingdom come together and say they want to go their way, and this is the kind of society that they want to, that this is saying through the masses now, then
Hmm.
one principle, true principle, have to just let them go, though it
Totally.
does nothing for the plight of the black race, because of course balkanization just makes you weaker, all this
Right.
kind of thing. But this thing is not as straightforward as it might look, because it's getting very, very complex, very, it's
Yeah,
getting.
it is. It is. And honestly, I think we need a separate session on secession. We might even call it that. But but because it really is like something we should tease out. And of course, we started like playing with the idea a bit when we talked about proletarian herdsmen. Um, but there's more to say there. But I guess I wanted to like raise it here as an intro to the wider conversation about why Nigeria is a scam, because there's a sense in which we kind of agree with these groups on one premise, which is
Mm.
that the Nigerian state as currently constituted is not working in the interest of the vast majority of
Obvious
people.
for everyone to see.
Yes, particularly the people at the bottom tier of the class ladder. Um, but then we definitely disagree on the if we agree on the diagnosis, I guess we definitely disagree on the prescription. So what should we do about it? And it shouldn't be that you know, it doesn't seem like we should try to split up on an ethnic basis, because it seems that just perpetuates the formation of new nationalities that cut across class lines rather than the formation of solidarities across class lines.
And
Or
more,
solidarities
sorry for
across the
interrupting
working
you.
class.
Sorry for interrupting you. And more importantly, that will still continue to perpetuate more and different types of exploitation, you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
so-called ethnic states and all. That's very, very important, because then the people, once again, it's going to be the people at the lower ranks, the lower, at least the lower class, the proletarians that will feel, cheated out. So, okay, we've broken up into our ethnic this thing. This is exploitation, or this is Yoruba nation. Now let's break into Ijebu nation, or, and,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And so the elite of all of those groups and micro groups will benefit because they get to have their own, who was a local government chairman before might become a governor in this situation. But
exactly,
the
exactly.
actual workers are now more balkanized, more cut off from their like fellow class members in the other group, which they could have united with before and used their numbers to fight back. I mean, and these are the sorts of things we kind of get into on the national and even international level, in the wider conversation that we have in a moment. But I thought it's worth like kind of at least doing an introductory um, exploration of the issue of succession, because obviously it's like it's a hotter topic now, I think, than it's probably been for a long time anyway in Nigeria.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so it seemed kind of relevant.
yeah. It's part of the symptoms and signs that the current arrangement is failing. And then instead of what revolutions or revolutionary thoughts or organization does is to steer society towards an upward evolution, towards a more just arrangement and all that.
Mm,
But the absence of the left and revolutionary movement and a viable revolutionary organization is allowing the country or the state to decay back to feudalism now, like
mm,
full blown. It's not like we don't have feudalism,
oh
but
yeah,
it's a state feudalist arrangement.
yeah,
Now it now wants to decay back and retrogress into that pre
yeah,
pre-independence feud, like full blown feudalism.
totally.
Yeah,
And then
so that's the
I think
problem.
I think part of what annoys me about the whole thing as well is that it wants to retrograde back to an imagined past that is worse than the actual past. Because for instance, like in the East, historically, at least as much as we can garner from oral history and such, Eastern groups were radically democratic and federalist. So they didn't have any unified king or whatever, right? Like they were sort of acephalous governed. And I know that's not like a utopian system per se, like it had its issues, but to then retrogress back to a situation where they then have one potentate, or one president or whatever, strikes me as a step backwards into an imagined past that is worse than the actual past. And the same can probably be argued in the West, where, even though there were like wars for a long stretch of time before colonialism between, say, the Oyo Empire and Ife, or smaller groups, to now step back into a situation where there's this kind of false unity that is tried to be, that one they try to impose on the Yoruba state, strikes me as like a historical in itself. So I'm at the risk of going even further into the conversation that we should have, in a more expanded format. Like that's part of what annoys me about the thing is that, you know, it seems also to be very poorly informed by actual history.
This, like I said, is a lack of analysis on the part of people that are championing this cause, because it will be very
Right.
interesting to see how they try to resolve if they get these states that they're clamoring for. It will be
Mm.
very, very interesting to see how they resolve the differences. Like you mentioned the Igbo guys now. So are you now going to have a universal easy,
Right.
for
Yeah.
your Igbo kid? How do you want to resolve that? Though again, it is still left for them to think about it and how they want
Definitely.
to go about. But like, how do you want to resolve all these things? Because at the bottom of all these things, you're not asking the main question, which humanity rests on top of, which is this exploitative arrangement. Is the Eze going to unilaterally claim that all land belongs to him, and then the king's men start acting like feudal lords and vassals over Anambra, over
Yeah.
Imo State, and how will that play out? What are you
Yeah.
guys going to do? So which
Right.
will still leave the masses with the short end of the stick, clamoring for maybe door to door statehood. We have
Yeah. Yeah.
how
You know,
or
but,
each,
but the funny thing is like, what would be what would be the difference between door to door statehood and what we have now? Like you already provide your own
your own
electricity,
electricity.
you already provide your own water, and you already provide your own security. So I mean, the only difference is that you don't tax yourself. Somebody else comes and
Ah,
does.
yeah,
You
they
know.
take the tax from
So
you. Yeah, and how much you pay for social service.
yeah. So I mean, can we conclude that by and large, the secessionist agitations have also proven to largely be scams as well?
Well, according to what we have on ground in
Yeah.
Nigeria and the context in which the people that are pushing for this secession are
Mm,
putting forward, it looks very, very much like a scam, because we've not heard them flesh out or arrange or tell us the kind of social relations that they are going to
mm,
establish after they get these nations. Rather, what we've gotten is all that points to the continuation of exploitation by fellow kinsmen. Like I said
mm.
earlier on, Sunday Igboho has said Tinubu should become the leader, the president of Yoruba nation. We all know the kind of person Tinubu is. We don't need to go into details as to, and all that, but
Yeah.
we all know that we are not getting anything different. If we wanted to just check or do a scorecard, look at Lagos and tell me how Lagos is doing under
Yeah.
the aegis or this thing of Tinubu. So we
Yeah.
don't want to go too far. This shows the level of thinking of the Yoruba Nation guys, and I'm sure Nnamdi Kanu has not itemized any form of new relations, social relations that he wants
No.
to establish. So they're not going deep into the crux of the matter. Therefore, my submission is that these guys really just want to create an enclave where they have their own control, since the contradiction of the Nigerian state is threatening to eat the arrangement. This current arrangement is threatening to eat it up. So it's a fail-safe card for the ethnic guys to just crawl back into where, just in case the Nigerian state crumbles and under the weight of his own contradiction. So they can just crawl back into the ethnic
Yeah.
arrangements and then start their own racket again. It's the
Yeah.
same way during independence, where we didn't establish the kind of social relations we're going to have, and we went for an exploitative one. So it's
Mm.
taken more than 60 something years now for the whole system to want to rend apart, and the next line of action is to crawl back into ethnic boxes and continue the exploitation until maybe another 20 years, where we see that it's not working again, and then we want to recede back into Ijebu
Yeah.
kingdom, and then go back
Yeah.
to uh,
Yeah.
maybe, like it's just a
Yeah.
mess.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
mess.
The Republic of
Yes,
Dolphin Estate.
the Republic of Dolphin Estate.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. As it stands now, in conclusion, it's more of a scam
Yeah.
than anything logical that they are pushing forward. Like I fail to see, the lights that these people are. I can't see it. I can't see
Yeah.
anything other than wanting to just break up.
this idea of the nation state itself is kind of funny because like the history of it, and not, there are disagreements about the history of how the nation state emerged, and I mean, in fact, even all of us on the show will have our various perspectives on it. But um for me, I mean, one critical aspect in the development of the nation state that has set us down a a scammed trajectory, um, is the fact that I think the solidarity of working people across the world was shattered through the kind of imperial encounter, where you had these merchant companies basically supported by um, like royal European royal families or you know aristocrats going across the world seeking for ways to effectively enrich themselves and their shareholders and calling it a national project. So the people who were slaving in the fields or in the factories were suddenly told that the ambitions of these merchant companies supported by royals and aristocrats was somehow going to redound to their own benefit. And of course, like working people across the world didn't buy that idea immediately, So there are these amazing examples of cotton weavers in Liverpool or Manchester, um, like opposing the slave trade and opposing slavery in America, right? Because that's where the cotton that they were weaving was coming from, and like feeling strong ties of solidarity to these people across the ocean, feeling like they had more in common with these people than they did with the owners of the factories, right? Because and that reality reflects the economic lived reality of these people, which is that they did have much more in common with like people who were wage slaves in another context than they did with their bosses in their immediate context. But that commonality has been blurred over time because of the emergence of these flags, national anthems, and boundaries that, in effect, work very well in the interest of the owners, right? And the interest of these people who are going on ships across the world, and those ships became aircrafts or whatever, right? To maximize profit, but not for the benefit of those people who are working under them. So for me, I think like some of the kernels, some of the like early seeds of the scam were actually sowed in Europe and not here, not even in the colonial world. And it's when the sort of popular movements in those parts of the world lost sight of the global import of the fight they were fighting, like within what OAG has referred to as the capitalist core, right? When working people there lost like their solidarity with working people elsewhere in the world who were kind of facing more brutal conditions of work imposed by the same companies that were hiring them or paying taxes in their own localities. When they stopped seeing those people as their real um, compatriots and started seeing their bosses as their real compatriots. I think that's when the seed of the scam was really sowed. So that was that model of like, the person who supposedly looks similar to you or speaks the same language of you, but lives in a completely different economic strata from you. That person is your compatriot rather than the person who isn't within the same economic strata as you. When that model was exported to our own context and we imported it and started learning national anthems and waving flags, that's when I think that the scam really became Nigerian, as it were. So yeah, I think I buy a lot of OAG's point about like the imperial origins of the scam, and how the nation state itself is kind of poisoned with that. Um, yeah, but there are other aspects I think that tie more directly to the question of Twitter. So I think in our era, um, like the way in which the economy now functions through creating a lot of distractions, spectacles, like atomizing technologies that have us retreat into our own living rooms or bedrooms or home offices and not engage with each other on the street, or not actually learn the difficult task of organizing movements together in a democratic manner. um, I think that contributes to the fracturing of solidarity, amongst working people. So yeah, I agree that like both the way in which Twitter operates and then the way in which like it then is banned, and we feel like the ban is the real assault on our rights. I think that itself has to be like is better understood within the context of the wider scam, which is that the people who are at the bottom are struggling to have through the ages been struggling to organize like solidarities that help them throw off the people who are at the top.
For me, I think that at the heart of the conversation around, scam really is independence. I think that that's what probably ties the conversation about, the ban, you know, um, to my own or our own idea of what Nigeria, what it means. I mean, what it means, what we mean when we say that Nigeria, as it were, was a scam. And I think it's about independence, and it's about the stories that we tell around independence. So the popular historical narrative will go first. We had founding fathers who came from the three major regions of major groups in Nigeria: um, South, Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, um, and that certain leaders within these groupings, namely Awolowo, Zeke, and this is not Tafa Balewa, no. Yeah, whatever. But anyways, this is the story that we all grew up to hear, and really, if you follow the stories, or even the activities of these guys, especially from when that history is told, it's usually that okay, they negotiated with the whites or the colonialists, and somewhere around um, the 50s, there was a constitutional conference which then birthed the Macpherson Constitution in 51. But what's really not told, and it's not told categorically, is that the story that's not told is that there's a struggle for independence that history kind of erases. The Nigerian history, the way it's told, the conventional Nigerian history, it doesn't lay any emphasis on the activities of certain groups of Nigerians and certain individuals between, say, 1944 and, say, 1950. Now, it's a very complex story, but I think what's useful is to say that the Nigerian struggle for independence was led by the bourgeoisie, and that within that bourgeoisie class, that you had two sides. You had those who were radical, and you had the conservatives. Now, the conservatives were the guys who then compromised, who then thought about independence from the point of view of constitutional reviews, right? But there was also a tendency within that bourgeoisie class that thought that they wanted a revolution, and that the steps that they took to get that revolution, in terms of how they organized, the protests that they led, what they did, is what put us in what even gave the conservatives the power to even negotiate with the British for and that's one side of it. But there's also, and I think this was what Sa'eed was trying to speak to, even though I caught just the last bit of it, the influence of merchant capital, who were also negotiators at that table. And what had happened was, at the time when those negotiations were over, the colonialists had thought to hand over power to the conservative side of the bourgeoisie class. And it's their own story that's largely been told. The story of the radical elements have never really been told. So it's not, common knowledge that there were people who tried to fuse labor into political. So the people who tried to fuse the activities of labor into politics, and that it was really debated at the time whether labor should be part of politics or whether they should have any real interests in politics. So I think essentially what I'm trying to say is, what we got as independence was perhaps political independence, right? But we never quite got economic independence, you know. So what had happened was that the guys who then took over power, the conservative, you know, side of the bourgeoisie class that took over power, namely the Awolowas, the Nnamdi Azikiwes, the Tafawa Balewas, and all these people, had people who had compromised with the British colonialists to ensure that their own business interests were always taken care of, you know. And that's been the story. Now, so whatever scam it is, I mean, for whatever injustice or whatever um, happened, what else happened after 1950, for instance, or 1960, if that's where our start date has just been building on top of what, you know, the foundation that, or the way that Nigeria was designed. We were designed to get political power, make it seem as though, okay, we were governing ourselves, but protecting the interest of big business, you know, merchant capital that were already entrenched and embedded within the Nigerian economic system. And they were the guys who were fleecing this country for what it was worth. So even when you got into the 70s and you started to talk about indigenization policies, what had just happened was that the guys who took over power had already gotten, you know, from the little that they were getting from, you know, being middlemen, you know, all through the years, they had already acquired some kind of capital to buy into um, um, parastatals, you know, yeah. So the whole, so big businesses that were already established, so we could just buy a share of it. You could get a share of it by virtue of the fact that you had accumulated wealth over time. But essentially, what the scam really is that, I mean, this is my own opinion, that basically at the point where a certain class of our leaders, you know, the conservative ones, decided that it was fine for them to go into bed with British colonialists so that they could get power, you know, and a lot of the things that they compromised on was even regionalism, you know, even so they understood that they weren't all going to get power at once, so they decided to agree that they could get power within regions, say the eastern region, the northern region, and then come to the center to then drag for whatever it was, you know. So that really set us back, you know, if you ask me. I don't know. I don't think I'm making the point as clearly as I can, but you know, that's, if it makes any sense to anybody here, what I'm trying to say. This is, for me, where the scam actually starts. The fact that Nigeria never really got economic power at independence and was largely dependent on an existing capitalist system, you know, one that wasn't in the interest of the working class, even though it was the working class itself who fought for the Nigerian independence, you know. And that's it. It was during this period that people like Paimodu came into prominence. The people who played active roles within that struggle, within that period, that are not as known, say Gogochu and Zeribe, for instance, Nduka Eze. These are guys who were in the Zikist movement at the time. And that if you really go deep into the history of the Zikist movement, it will be clear that someone like Nnamdi Azikiwe sold out. You know, he threw them, those young lads, under the bus. And he threw them under the bus. I mean, so when you even talk about the ban in 50, it was only after the ban of Zikist movement in April of 1950 that there was, the hounding before then of Zikists, members of the Zikist movement, before its eventual ban, was what paved way for the Constitutional Conference of 1950, which then gave birth to the Macpherson Constitution. And then when you listen to historians, they tell you that, okay, this is the first time when Nigerians were actually beginning to self-govern. But when you say Nigerians, it was a group of Nigerians who had brokered a deal with the colonialists. And the colonialists were happy to hand over to this group of people because they knew that business interests of merchant capital, you know, would be protected. And it's so The scam is that however Nigeria is set up economically as a system, it's always been set up to protect the interests of people within a certain power block, the people who are actually compromised. So it's not Nigerian. The Nigerian co- nation was not designed to favor or protect the interest of those who actually fought for its own independence. And so that's in a nutshell. Well, that's not a nutshell, but that's essentially what I'm trying to say.
I should say, of course, these are themes that we have reflected on to some extent before, and that we'll reflect on in much more depth in subsequent episodes. So, for instance, the question of the Z case that Emeka has raised, like we said before, there's like we are working on, and we'll put out sometime soon an episode specifically focused on the Zikists and exploring their own influence and role in the independence struggle. So, I mean, I think this conversation then is much more of a teaser into our wider perspectives about what we mean when we're referring to the scam, such that, yeah, I'm sure there's, listeners who might have seen it initially and thought, oh, look, these guys are going to talk about Hush Puppy or Yahoo Yahoo guys. And surely we will.
That
But
one
I
said,
mean, that one's that one day. But I mean, what we're referring to, I think, is probably something much more foundational um, to the Nigerian experience than that. And in fact, I think from my perspective, and I'm sure others will share this view, that stuff is at best only a symptom, of the underlying condition that we're trying to address. Um, so that's I think the kinds of idea those are the kinds of ideas we have in mind when we're referring to Nigerian scam.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I want to add that we should also try to see, as Emeka put out there nicely, like the contribution of the radical guys and then how they are written out of history, such that you barely find their story on any mainstream media or even being taught in schools. Like, this is to show you the power of the dominating class and how they not only control the economy, but the cultural institutions, the educational institutions, and of course, we've seen the social media and all these things, to legitimize and rob us off the intellectual materials to question their domination. And I also have to add that the balance of power in historical processes, it changes at times for a short period, at times for a long period. And we should understand that imperialism already, with superior firepower, the domination of black people, domination of whole continents and all that, the place where Africans were negotiating from a very short period, or for a very short period, was okay from a place of not from a place of power, but for a very short period of time, it changed into when the nationalist sentiment all across the countries that colonialism was trampling upon people, when the side effects or the contradictions of the imperialist class got to a head, and then the nationalist fervor was high and blowing very very high. They had no choice, but or than to just say, okay, yeah, we're going to give you guys this independence in quotes. But now we have to go into the nature of even that political power that we got. Because now, if we got a political power that is not for the people, then essentially, I don't even think, in the context of our nationhood, that's a political power that we should categorize as something for us, which even further cements this scam. Like, even that political power in quote that we got is in the context of imperial domination. So, like, and this ties into the discussion I was having with Saeed in the beginning. That, look, if you're able to mobilize with the masses and let them know that this is what we are up against, then it's easier to resist. Such that when you face the backlash or the strangulation of imperialism, you're able to unite with the people and then come up with more revolutionary policies to resist and get that genuine independence, as we've seen with some countries that did their national liberation struggles, maybe through armed struggle, or that understood the class function and then not necessarily just saying we have independence, but to uproot that class structure that was going to perpetuate or still keep them maldeveloped and underdeveloped, you know. And we see countries like maybe Guinea-Bissau with Amilcar Cabral, or even them Thomas Sankara that tried to rearrange the military structure to favor the people and all that. So even what I'm just trying to say to add to Emeka's point is that even that political power that we got is a scam too. Like, so that's why the thing it becomes the active component or the active ingredient in further cementing the economic policies that doesn't
Mm.
put the or that puts the masses in a place where we're always at a disadvantage and all that. So
No,
I just want
solid.
to add a little bit of point to that
Yeah, I
one.
mean, but
I don't know
okay,
if
so far our
it kind
narrative
of
has
jives with
focused,
what we're saying on the ground.
when we're
Yeah.
explaining the scam, we focused primarily on um, the role of imperialism and also on the kind of international context out of which independence emerged. We've also focused on the historical dimension in terms of like the nature of the independence movement and how it ended up favoring the conservative elements rather than some of the radical or workers' um, elements that were also pushing for independence. But I think like beyond that historical moment, it I'd be interested in hearing how people reflect on the scam since independence. In the republics that have followed since then. And Emeka was getting at this a bit with his reflection, with your reflection on indigenization. But I'm also interested in democratization, right? Um, because in the 90s we
You're
supposedly
breaking up,
started.
Said. You're breaking up.
Oh shit, that's too bad.
Yeah, you're breaking up. You can try to maybe pause for a while and or try to move around to see if you can get better network.
Okay, I think Emeka was hearing me and wanted to start responding. So
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
just go ahead.
yeah. So, I mean, part of one way to think about it is just even listening to conversations that people are having. So I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago. I woke up and I saw that OAG had responded to some tweet. And that's how he came on my own radar. And then this guy was making claims that um, all the governments that we've had, was it all the governments have been socialists, or
Oh yeah,
Marx? I mean, would you remind me? I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
even remember.
I
But
think the tweet was something about the APC being a socialist or communist government or something, that kind of thing. And then he was kind of saying yes that their policies, is bad for the country. Nigeria is a socialist country essentially, with specific attention to Buhari, and that's like a nutshell of what he said
yeah,
with that.
no, no, no. But you see, the
so the
thing is,
guy is now in the labor camp, making big rocks, small rocks, and and reading Mao in the evening.
Nah, nah, nah.
but
It's hard.
Okay.
and but I went back to that tweet a couple of hours later, maybe 24 hours later, and I saw that it had gained some kind of traction. And with certain people saying, yeah, that's the problem, that we don't even understand that Nigeria is, that these guys are socialists. And I'm like, wait, hold on. And this for me is the effect of the scam, and it's what shows me, or what tells me that, if, the fraud, as it were, is a successful one, where people don't even understand basic rudiments of the economy and of their own country, or how it is that it is structured.
Oh man.
You know,
Yeah, the connection.
mm, yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
and
I hate to say it, but this itself isn't too far removed from the scam question, is it? The shitty network.
so I think some. Yeah, I mean, for me, okay. So I'm saying,
I think Emeka should take the point again.
yeah. So I'm saying that just the other day I was on Twitter, and I saw that, some guy make some claim about, the way the Nigerian society is organized. Basically, that is organized around socialist worldviews, and that even Buhari is a socialist, and and first things
Yeah.
first, that I don't get where that's coming from, but I also understand that perhaps it's a marker to show that the scam as it was orchestrated, you know, during independence is one that has become very successful, where people tend to see um, um, welfareism, as socialism to an extent, where people get
Yeah.
handouts and all of that. I don't know that you go to England tomorrow and you don't see that, that there are elements of it being a welfarist state. And when you look at the
Yeah.
NHS, or the fact that people who are unemployed actually have other means to get something from the state. But I don't know that anybody who in
Well,
their
but
rights,
Emeka, look,
yeah,
I mean, look, okay, I think that point is very interesting, and I've been reflecting on that a little bit because although I'm off Twitter, people keep sending me screenshots of various people calling Buhari socialist because people know that it really annoys me, and it's a really ridiculous idea. But I think um, tracing the origin of that back to independence is like an interesting project, but I think there might be even more contemporary sources of that kind of perspective. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think the example of the UK might be slightly less analogous from this standpoint because they do have like a bit of a historical welfare state. But I think the example of the US maybe is a bit of a better analogy to understand how people in Nigeria might think about Buhari as a socialist because he said that he wants to take people out of poverty. Insofar as like Americans also have this kind of knee jerk, American conservatives anyway.
I think, Saeed, you're breaking. You have to take this point
Oh
once
man,
again.
I was just about to land. Um, no, but I was, responding.
Go near your window.
I had to. Okay, let's try. Is this any better? Uh, okay.
yeah,
Well, sorry to
from my
interrupt,
own
Emeka.
end.
I mean, vibing with a lot of what you were saying. And I also saw a lot of those tweets. And every time there's a new conversation on Twitter about Buhari being a socialist, despite my being off Twitter, somehow I get brought into it because people send me these WhatsApps, screenshots of that conversation. And I agree with you that, this is one of the outcomes. This is probably one of the long term outcomes of the kind of education we have about independence. But I think it's also an outcome of the kind of education that people get about the economy. And that education they probably get from like consuming a lot of American like nonsense or like just consuming a lot of conservative thinking that if a government intervenes like in any sector of the economy or social life, then that's socialist, which is very ridiculous because I mean, we've just seen heavily interventionist conservative parties emerge in a lot of the world. Trump being an example, like a lot of what Buhari is doing here in terms of economic nationalism, in terms of like tariffs on specific goods, and even in terms of like certain conceptions of welfare are like being pioneered and put in place by conservative governments across the world. So Trump also did Trump bucks. He gave people like cash transfers at the start of the COVID pandemic. The Conservative Party in the UK is also doing all this interventionist shit. So I think it's a miseducation that goes back to independence, but I think it's also just a miseducation that like reflects their very
You're,
poor understanding of how contemporary politics is operating.
you're breaking him. You're breaking. Saeed.
Okay, that's fine because I was done anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point. I get your point, Said. But I think that I also think that it's not just, how do you say it? It's not. It's. I mean, if the education or the narration of history, the history of the independence struggle in Nigeria was told properly, or it's one that doesn't exclude, you know, the struggle from the point of view of the Nigerian left now, as it were. people would probably better understand, the global system, the global economic system, way better than they do now. And then it will become some kind of filter so that when you absorb what it is that you absorb from the West, say whether America or Great Britain, you would have some kind of filter, to help you process it. Otherwise, I really, I don't, maybe I haven't thought about it properly, but I don't know why anyone would think that we've had. I mean, that nothing in history supports it, really. I mean, there were parties in the 1970s in Nigeria, strictly socialist parties, which were not registered for elections. You understand? So the history of Nigeria has been such that the Nigerian state, the guys who took over power from the colonialists, have done everything in their power to see to it that we do not even have a socialist party emerge for even being elected, not to talk of winning an election or and all whatnot. So it I mean it sounds very funny to me when I hear somebody say that um, we've had that the socialist ideologies or policies are what is responsible or is what is responsible for the state of the nation today. It's absurd, really. I mean, if I quote Chimamanda, it's obscene that anyone would think that, but it's also a function of the fact that perhaps the left, hasn't done its own job in telling its own stories, and maybe it's only just beginning to do that now, you know. But we're not even anywhere close to where we need to be, in terms of putting out, an alternate history of the Nigerian independence struggle, one that actually does glorify the activities and the efforts of those who actually, I mean, the whole of the Zikist movement, history of the Zikist, is littered with people who were arrested for what, 12 years, um, 3 years, for months, because of the roles that they played. I mean, it's probably it will be news to people that, that an attempt was made on the life of a colonial secretary in this country, and that these were these that it was strategic in the sense that they wanted to cause an uprising. People don't get that history, but that's even not part of what we discuss or we're looking to discuss when we talk about the economics of it. But look at a company like UAC. What do people think that the UAC represents in Nigeria? What do they think that the oil companies have come to represent in Nigeria? And that when policies are made by successive governments, you know, um, an Abacha, for instance, killed Ken Sarawiwa because he was agitating for what? Environmental issues in the Niger Delta, you know. And I mean, the issues, you might not like the messenger, but the issues that this guy was, advocating for were issues that were central to the lives and livelihoods of people who inhabited a certain part of the Niger Delta. And what fate did he meet? He was killed because the government of the day thought, okay, oil revenues first before the people. So when somebody comes to me and says somebody is it, the question you need to ask yourself is what interest do policies that they push, whose interest do they represent? All of Buhari's policies, or most of Buhari's policies today, whose interest, does it represent? Is it the interest of the masses? you know have we had land reforms in that sense where you put what, so what when people, where do they clock these things out of? And I think, if without proper grounding, without proper understanding of where we're coming from, people then begin to make all sorts of naive silly statements, as to the fact that we have been led, that the reason why we're in this mess is because we have had socialist ideas.
Yeah, but look, I, I I agree with a lot of that. I just want to suggest that maybe not all of it is good faith, as in maybe not all of it is ignorance. Maybe some of it is actually politics, as in defining your adversary in a way that you think in a way that you think is easy, makes it easier for you to attack them, right? So, like in a hyper conservative context such as ours, even center right policies will be framed as socialist because you just know that if something is socialist, then it's so off the rails that it's not even worth considering. you know so maybe I agree with you that, like, there is a huge gap in knowledge, but I think even if some of these people knew about the PRP and like socialist parties we've actually had, even if they knew about the existing socialist movements today in Nigeria who fundamentally oppose Buhari and continue to denounce him, etc., they would still argue that he's socialist because for them, they are aware that conservatives have a lot of the material and political power, so they can define their opponents however they wish. Inter-conservative squabbles can be framed as though they are ideological battles between the left and the right. And that was epitomized in the 2019 elections, right, where Atiku came out saying that he's the right winger and these guys are the left. When it's like, no, you guys are barely distinguishable from a really like a historically informed left right perspective. So I guess the main point I'm making there, or the main question I'm asking is like, how do you distinguish the aspects that are genuine ignorance from the aspects that are like bad faith conservatism?
I hear you, and I think that, I mean, you've made your, I mean, you're pushing a very solid argument, but position, but I think that at the end of the day, the way I think about it is, if more people were informed, then it would become increasingly difficult for bad faith actors to make very silly statements. But what you find now
Mm,
is, they make these statements, and then there's a mass of people behind them, nudging them on, because basically it's basically because of the gap in knowledge. It's ignorance, if you ask me. Because if more people knew, you know, had more access to, you know, this this history of Nigerian struggle that has been excluded, that's been deliberately erased from popular narrative, it will become increasingly difficult for people like bad faith actors to be making sentiments that they're making, pushing opinions that are neither here. In fact, that nothing supports historically, you know. But
mm,
because people don't have access to that knowledge, what you find is that it's popular narrative that then allows them think that they're making any valid points, or that they're making any
yeah,
sense in any real context. Because what I hear is a whole lot of rubbish. But it's also possible, and this is something that I'm willing to concede, that a lot of us will just go frontally and attack, without taking time to actually get into debates. You know, I personally don't really have that time anymore. But I'll just ask questions so that I know, okay, where perhaps this problem is coming from. But I think we need to, and this is why for me it's important that the left, actually sits up and then is able to rise up to the occasion, because the amount of work that needs to be done to educate people who are ignorant, um, and I'm not talking about even the working class now. I'm just even talking about, within bourgeois classes where, these conversations are ongoing. Is that for those who aren't well formed or who aren't stuck in any ways, in their own ways, as it were, um, there's a chance that if we begin to push these narratives out to spaces like the universities where people are just getting their education, we might be able to salvage something. Because um, when you say that the way, the dominant ideology in this country is the capitalist one, this is just one example of it. Because people can't even think
yeah,
beyond, can't see beyond their noses. It's I mean, it's painful, but what can one do? I mean, sometimes you just have to laugh it off. But I think that, um, if we had more people with access to this information, then it will become very difficult for people or bad faith actors to actually have a field day talking nonsense. That's honestly what I think about it.
yeah.
just to add to the points that you guys have beautifully made, I'm going to quote Mr. Komolafe on this one, Mr. Gbenga Komolafe, P1 secretary. He said the greatest victory or triumph of the neoliberal order is the destruction of emancipatory education.
Mm.
Now we have to understand that even what we call education is part of the superstructure that springs from you know because we have a base and then a superstructure. If you have a base, which is economics, the social relations of production, and all that, the base influences and shapes the superstructure, which education is part of, which culture is part of, which religion is part of, which law is part of, which the nature of the state is part of, and all that. So we expect that in a neoliberal society, in a capitalist society, we expect that the education should be anti-socialist, that it should be anti-revolutionary, that it should be anti-people, that it should keep distracting the people from from questioning that base itself, that antagonistic relations of society. So I'd say that even on the university campuses, they are not neutral terrains anymore. So
Hmm.
they're not neutral terrains anymore. If you come with revolutionary ideology or you're trying to teach socialist thing and all that, you meet heavy resistance from the higher ups.
Yeah.
This is what we are facing now. We must now see that everything that makes up our society, it has taken or has now been infected by the dominant social order, such that those components of the superstructure now act as defenders of the capitalist system. It now acts as things that stabilize the capitalist system. So the education we go to school to get, how we are being socialized in our societies, and how we see ourselves is essentially in terms of being pro-capitalist, defending it, even if it's unconsciously. So we have to be conscious that most of these people, they are never, almost never, going to find anything emancipatory or revolutionary in the normal school settings or normal media settings or just books that you pick up from library and all that. You now have to be conscious, like then where Emeka said the function of the left now. Let's even look at the nature of the left that we have and what we call the left in Nigeria. Is it really existing? Has it gone to sleep, or has it totally been beaten into subservience by the dominating power of these elites? Like, let's look at the labor unions. How do they get their leaders? This type of thing. Like, is it now essentially a toothless bulldog that just barks once a while and then crawls back into its cage to just kind of make it seem as if they have the appearance of labor, whereas it's not fulfilling its
Yeah.
historical duty. You understand what I'm saying? So we should.
Just so members can keep paying dues.
So we should understand that institutions serve a
Us.
societal function, and we shouldn't expect that the institutions that we have in our society are going to contribute as they are.
No, let me just add something to that, which is that I mean, I we all agree that political education is important, and I think the quote that OAG started with, emphasizes nothing more than that. But I think it's also important to like try to tease out the next step is like, okay, who will be the target and what kind of venues are most appropriate for that? And I'm not convinced that it's, like OAG is saying, I think if you go to a lot of campuses and try to preach, try to engage people on the subject of Marxism or whatever, it's not only the higher ups that you even have issues with. I tell you, some of those guys you're talking to would want to slap you or tell you to get the hell out of there, right? Because like the mentality now is like you've got to hustle to blow, and that's the point. So these and that is every man for himself, right? And like I don't think that comes from nowhere. I think that yeah, like we're saying, it's like kind of what people have been taught within the context of the Nigerian capitalist system. But I think it's also the global zeitgeist, um, and I think like how it manifests here is particularly pernicious, where you'll see people, you know, as I was, as we've reflected on briefly in other episodes, you'll see that there's like a huge Trump fan base in Nigeria, or you'll see that like Nigerians are like hugely in favor of massive corporations and have no issues with like global monopoly capital or any of that stuff. you know so like a lot of those young people have picked their side. It's not that they're ignorant, it's that they've like, sure, maybe they don't know a huge amount about the history of the left or the world of the left, but
Mm,
like learning about it, I mean, they will learn about it through their existing frame of reference, and it will be one that makes that knowledge easy to dismiss. So that's not to say
mhm,
that there's no alternatives left for folks who want to do political education. I just don't think that the best way to go about it is through trying to target the kind of like upper middle class Twitter handle, like havers, and it might not necessarily even be through the tertiary education system, which in the 70s and 80s was one of the key ways in which the left was trying to grow in Nigeria. And I think that to some extent, the results of that period suggest that maybe that strategy had certain limitations.
No, no, I don't think. Oh shit!
You just spilled your stout on your laptop.
I wish that's what it was. Anyway,
Okay,
uh,
because you would have at least been able to drink the remainder.
no, no, this whole thing would have been off. But anyways, don't make me bleed. I'm not joking now. I, 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 I don't quite agree with you on that bit.
Okay.
Um, I think that if people hadn't tried to um, inject radical ideas into the university system in Nigeria in say maybe from the 60s, actually from mid 60s, actually perhaps it reached its heights in the 70s and then maybe started to wane in the 80s, but you know it had at least a decade and more under his belt of real intellectual work that went into injecting radical ideas within campuses. What we then began to see was, um, a proliferation of radical student unions, radical wings, radical students within different traditions. And when you look at that history, you find that each tradition was unique. So you had the UI axis, you had the Ife axis, you had the Ahmadu Bello one, and
Yeah.
then you had those in Calabar and in another small pockets. In fact, part of that
Yeah,
history,
and I think we'll come back to this question of the student movement and the left in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s. I mean, particularly in the 70s, because I think it's a really interesting
yeah,
focus. So, but yeah,
yeah, but
sorry to interrupt, but I think
and
we should do
there
a
was not
separate episode
yeah.
on.
Yes, and there was no one time when they had massive numbers, okay, but they had numbers enough to make the effect that they had was such that it made a significant number, even though small, of students understand that they had to link their own advocacy to advocacy of workers in the country, the state of the working class, and all of that. Because at the end of the day, once they left school, they were also going to get into the job markets. So they, that building of social consciousness was there. It wasn't it didn't reach the height where maybe it would have caused big problems. But don't forget that sometime in the late 70s, I think it was around 78, maybe 79, that I think it was Obasanjo who said that what we had on campus were teachers who were they're being paid, that they were paying teachers to teach, that teachers were teaching, they were paying teachers to teach what something, I can't remember that phrase now.
What they didn't ask them to teach,
What
something
they
like
didn't
that.
ask you, yeah, what they didn't ask you to teach. Now, I mean, that just goes to show that I mean, whatever else anybody thinks, there was something had begun to brew on campuses across Nigeria, and then Obasanjo it was also who fought tooth and nail to see that he
Yeah,
quenched.
but Emeka, like, I think, okay, I think we should get into this debate at. No, I think this is a really interesting debate to have. And I suspect actually our views diverge quite a bit when it comes to the question of campus leftists, or campus communists, as some people like to disparagingly refer to them. Um, And like I'm not entirely unsympathetic to what you're saying, that like the campuses have been a kind of nucleus for certain kinds of struggle in Nigerian history. But I just think that, and again, I think we'll have this debate more fully in a separate episode. But I just think that, to tie back to what OAG was saying at the very beginning, that there's really no substitute for like mass social mobilization if you're going to try to carry out a socialist project in the post-colonial world, or even in the core. And I think that the kind of like focus on building this intellectual wing of radicals sometimes runs at cross purposes with the wider focus of trying to build a mass movement, because those two things are not necessarily, I mean, it seems like they might go hand in hand, but within our history they haven't necessarily gone hand in hand. So you will find that there's people who can speak in all this like leftist jargon on campuses, but then the moment you leave the gates of the campus, everybody is still toiling in their like oppressive social conditions, and I've never heard of any of this stuff, right? So there's an extent to which it becomes a kind of reified esoteric elite culture, associated with men with graying afros and the wearing of African outfits, and but they never exactly, but they never can actually connect to the day-to-day struggles of ordinary people. And I know there were moments when student activists intervened forcefully into national political questions, like students were part of structural adjustment protest or anti-structural adjustment protest. Students were part of anti-apartheid protest, and even till today, the National Association of Nigerian Students continues to protest whenever there's like xenophobia in South Africa or that kind of thing. But I think that, if we focus our attention on campuses or on Twitter or whatever, we risk keeping this like consciousness, at the very least, at the very most, at some fringes of the upper middle class and the middle class. So it remains an elite, like esoteric elite club, rather than a mass movement, which is the end goal. But again, this is a wider conversation I think we can flesh out, with more
Yeah,
examples and such in a,
yeah.
in a, in
I
a, in
still,
a broader
by the way,
episode.
by the way, I
Yeah.
still don't agree with you, Said. But just to chip this in before,
Yeah, I
we
didn't think you would.
yeah, yeah, we will. But let me just get this out of the way
I know you
quickly,
love
so
that.
that yes, I
The shiki. Okay, okay. No, maybe Emeka lands and then we can pivot to
yeah,
the
no,
to the
I need to
final
get this
thoughts.
out. I need to get this out of the way. It won't kill anybody. So I understand you when you say that mass organization is the end point, really. But then there are strategies to get to that point. And what I mean, injecting radical ideas into campuses just serves a purpose. It's not the end. At the very least, it's maybe just the beginning. And I think that even from the 60s, 70s, it was not seen as the end result. That things didn't come to a head in terms of the fact that it didn't lead to revolution is not enough reason to discard the foundational idea behind it in the first place. I mean, that's all I'm going to say. I mean, and then when we find time to discuss this, I probably will have more to say. But yes, that's me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation, and I think it would be interesting to reflect a bit on the Ethiopian revolution in that conversation, which was one that was led very largely by student radicals who came out of the campus and tried to do mass movement. But yeah, we'll talk. I'm sure we'll have more to say about that at a later date. Um, so should we like kind of wrap up with final thoughts about the scam?
I think that it will be interesting. I mean, in closing, this is what an observation. I think it will be interesting to explore, similarities or the dissimilarities of, say, the Zikist movement, which for me is um, was really essentially a movement, and the NSAS moment, if I'm allowed to say that, because I don't know if NSAS was a movement, and I know that we've had that conversation before, and I maybe I've gone to both poles, saying okay, it's a movement, maybe it's not a movement, but anyways, I think that it's important that might be very useful to try and see what whether there um, similarities between both. I mean, essentially, these are things that were powered by youths, and the guys who were Zikists were very young guys, maybe even in their late teenage years, maybe in their early 20s at the time when, they had these things going for them. Um, what they did even with the River Valley massacre, was astonishing, you know. But of course, they also have two different trajectories in terms of how they were bettered and how even um, the organization. I mean, and it's the organization that I find very interesting. So I think it was Tenor who was speaking early on in this during the recording, and I think I made a mental note of it that because the Zikis had leaders. I mean, they had the general secretary, they had the president. At any time they ran into problems with the state, they always ended up in prison. I mean, all of them from Raji Abdallah to, you know, and then I think what I was amused by was the fact that when I look at the NSAS, there were no leaders to arrest, so they're just picking random guys, off the streets, and those were the guys who spent, some time in prison. And even in the news today, you'd even hear that how many months, maybe 6 months after, or even 7, 8 months after the protest, there are people who are just getting released from, you know, prison cells, and that the reason you can find links between why they were there in the first place and the NSAS moment. That's just what I thought to say.
Um, just looking at what I actually had written on ZK's turn, but I think we can wrap up. I mean, in there somewhere be a full episode, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, all right. I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
Peace.
Peace, y'all.
Leaders.